Mr. President, what about the Japanese? (1940). In August 1940, the pro-German Vichy government in France allowed Japanese troops and planes to occupy Indochina. In October, General Hideki Toho took charge of the Japanese government. A populist and extremist, he offered the Americans a deal. If the United States lifted the embargo and stopped helping China, Japan would withdraw from Indochina. The Americans replied by saying that Japan should leave China and Indochina without conditions. Pearl Harbor was a strategically vital advanced post for the United States in the Pacific. The Japanese knew that any action against the U.S. fleet would mean war, though if they could destroy it, they thought the price was worth paying. The Americans knew a Japanese attack was likely, though they could not know for sure when and where it would take place. The military commanders considered Hawaii to be too ambitious to be included in Japan's imperialist plans. Japan had modernized at great speed. It was a commercial power and possessed formidable military forces. Tokyo, the center of the Japanese Empire, had become a modern city where business was done in a way that befitted the capital of the East's most industrialized nation. The Philippines, the strategic heart of the Far East, less than 480 kilometers from the Japanese bases at Formosa, and almost 8,000 kilometers from the U.S. bases at Pearl Harbor. For the Japanese, the Philippine archipelago is an objective that must be achieved in the short term. Manila Bay and its port are key strategic points. In July 1941, with war clouds gathering over the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur arrives in the Philippines to take charge of the U.S. Army in the Far East. MacArthur is not an unfamiliar figure, having previously spent 10 years on the islands. He began recruitment of Philippine soldiers for training as U.S. officers. Anti-aircraft defenses are in poor state of repair, and only 2 radar systems are working on the whole archipelago. The Philippine Army has around 100,000 men on active service, but the majority have never fired a weapon. Meanwhile, in Washington, interventionist and isolationist demonstrations took place in front of the White House. In the autumn of 1941, Roosevelt had done everything possible to prepare the country for the conflict, which he saw as inevitable. Worried by the fascist movements in Italy and Germany, as well as by Japanese expansionism, his hands were tied by the official policy of neutrality. The American press waited to see what the nation's enemies would do. If there had to be war, it would be the other side that started it. Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, held discussions with the Japanese, asking them to end their aggression against China. but the Japanese diplomats brushed aside their concerns, already knowing the intentions of their own government. On the 26th of November 1941, a special envoy of the Japanese government and Ambassador Nomura visited the U.S. State Department, where they were informed of the latest American proposal. War could not be avoided if Japan continued its policy of aggression in Asia. At the same time as Ambassador Nomura was negotiating in Washington, the Japanese High Command ordered the First Imperial Fleet to sail from the Kuriles Islands to a position northwest of Pearl Harbor. It was not possible to detect it, as it did not use radio and sailed with lights off in shallow waters. Toho knew war was inevitable and gave his full support to Yamamoto to carry through Plan Zeta, which aimed at the destruction of the U.S. naval force in the area. At the same time, 16 submarines closed in on Hawaii to join in the attack. 5 of them towed pocket submarines capable of penetrating the port of Pearl Harbor. At the Imperial Conference of the 1st of December 1941, the Japanese government decided all the doors to a peaceful solution to the conflict with the Americans were closed. On the 5th of December, Nagumo received the coded signal, "Climb Mount Nitaka." With this, the emperor gave his blessing to the attack, believing that war was the lesser of two evils. On the next day, 9 U.S. battleships, 7 cruisers, and other smaller ships waited in Pearl Harbor. The aircraft carriers are far away on maneuvers. Despite the fact that this was a blow to their plans, the Japanese nevertheless maintained the order to attack. While Nagumo's aircraft carriers approached the islands, in Washington, the U.S. Secret Service had intercepted information that made them believe that a declaration of war was very close, though at no time did they think there would be an attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese ambassador was called in on a number of occasions, but he kept the Americans waiting, knowing that Japanese planes were heading for Hawaii. The air attack was to be in 2 waves. The first was composed of 49 bombers, 40 torpedo launchers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 escort planes. The submarines were to prevent any American reaction. If the element of surprise was achieved, the torpedo launchers would be the first to attack, and the dive bombers were to destroy Hickam Field, Wheeler, and Ford Island. If surprise was lost, the bombers were to be the first to attack. The second wave was composed of 170 aircraft and was to finish off the damage done by the first. Life was going on as normal on the island. It was a sunny day with good visibility. At the enormous U.S. Army radar station at Opana, screens indicate a large number of planes at 200 kilometers approaching from the northwest. The duty officer, Lieutenant Kermit Tyer, from Fort Shafter, expecting a contingent of B-17s from the continent, believes them to be U.S. planes. It is 7:20 in the morning on the 7th of December, 1941, and the planes of Commander Fuchida fly over the west coast of the island. At 7:55, the Japanese dive bombers begin their attacks on the 6 U.S. air bases at Hawaii. The U.S. planes on the ground are destroyed one after another in a chain of explosions. It is Sunday morning. The American pilots are absent. The attack has hardly begun when Lieutenant Heijiro Abe destroys the side of the battleship West Virginia. The Japanese torpedo launchers dive and attack the battleships. A torpedo sinks the Helena, 2 more hit the California, and the Oklahoma suffers a number of hits that cause flooding sufficient to sink the ship. Nagumo's pilots are familiar with the Pearl Harbor base, as they studied models of it and chose their targets with care. The attack squadrons, facing no opposition in the air, repeatedly dive and attack the U.S. battleships and aerodromes, destroying most of the aircraft on the ground. Stunned during the first moments of the attack, the American troops cannot believe the dantesque panorama in front of their eyes. The devastating attack by dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo launchers has caused a holocaust of destruction, devastating everything in its path. The American soldiers try to reach their combat stations under the fire of Japanese aircraft that are shooting at will. The destroyer Monaghan is able to react in time and attacks a Japanese submarine. The Tennessee and the Arizona are hit and suffer the effects of a number of explosions. The battleship Nevada tries to get away from the bay, and a hail of bombs force it to run aground. At 8:25, the first attack ends, leaving nearly all the U.S. ships and planes out of action. The second wave commenced at 8:40. Composed of 134 bombers and 36 fighters, under the orders of Commander Shimazaki of the aircraft carrier Zukaku. They again attacked the air bases of Hickam Field and Ford, along with the hydroplanes at Kenosha. This time, the U.S. defenses were able to shoot down some planes, in spite of the fact that the Pennsylvania, the Nevada, and 3 destroyers were put out of action. At 10 in the morning, Nagumo, fearful that the aircraft carriers Lexington and Enterprise could surprise them at any moment, ordered the return of his planes. In all the chaos and confusion, the Japanese pilots left intact the U.S. oil tanks containing reserves for 1 year. Nagumo's decision, in opposition to the views of his officers, not to authorize a third attack, had important consequences for the development of the war. Husband Kimmel, the commander of Pearl Harbor's naval forces, described the attack as an act of treachery, but one that was nevertheless well executed. The success of the Japanese attack was not total, as the aircraft carriers of the United States Pacific Fleet were thousands of miles away. Had they been located, then the Japanese would surely have launched a massive attack against them. The Japanese ambassador delivered the declaration of war after the attack had begun. Never before was such a crushing victory achieved in so short a space of time. The Japanese destroyed 18 ships and 188 planes, and left a further 159 planes seriously damaged, along with 2,400 dead and 1,800 wounded U.S. personnel. The Japanese themselves lost 60 men and only 29 planes and 5 pocket submarines. The Japanese government presented the attack on Pearl Harbor as a great victory for the country, something that the autocratic regime could be proud of. The military had fulfilled its promise, had demonstrated the power of the Japanese Empire by achieving the impossible, the destruction of the American fleet. The greatness or decadence of our empire depends on this battle, Yamamoto had said. A total of 188 planes and 300,000 tons in naval shipping were destroyed, with the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Tennessee, the Pennsylvania, and the Nevada all sunk, although 70 vessels came out of the attack unharmed. As clouds of smoke rose above the base of Pearl Harbor, those present tried to take in the scale of the disaster. 15 days after the attack, they were still pulling out the bodies of sailors from the wreckage of the West Virginia. The United States had been dragged into the international conflict. News of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor reaches Washington and the White House. On the 8th of December, large numbers of people gather in front of the Capitol in Washington. They are waiting for the president to arrive at an emergency session of Congress. The policy of neutrality is over. Finally, Roosevelt can act.
The Congress declare that since
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The flames of the Second World War have reached the United States. Roosevelt said that they could not know when final victory would be achieved. But the harder they hit the enemy now, the shorter the war would be in the long run. The Japanese have just attacked Pearl Harbor. The forces in the Philippines are on maximum alert, and the U.S. commanders are aware that Japanese ambitions have no limit. From their bases in Formosa, Japanese planes head for the Philippines. Their mission is to attack the Haifa and Clark airfields, but due to poor weather, they are 6 hours behind schedule, and therefore worried that they have lost the element of surprise. Fearful of an attack, and after more than 3 hours in the air, the U.S. planes based in the Philippines have not spotted any Japanese aircraft. Relieved, they return to their bases to refuel. While the crews take a rest and have something to eat, the Japanese planes approach Clark Airfield. The attack is devastating. Flying at low level over the Haifa and Clark airfields, the Japanese planes destroy more than 100 U.S. B-17 and P-40 aircraft on the ground, achieving control of the skies in the area. On the first day of the war, the Air Force of the Far East, the backbone of the Philippines' defense, is destroyed. The next target is the U.S. naval base at Cavite. The Japanese bombers, out of range of the U.S. guns, turned Manila Bay into a death trap. "57,000 men under General Hama invaded small islands to build airfields. Masters of the skies, the Japanese began to land on the north of the island of Luzon, encountering little resistance. In 3 weeks of fighting the invading Japanese forces, with half the soldiers of the combined U.S. and Philippine armies marched towards the capital, Manila. With no help available from the Navy and his aircraft destroyed, MacArthur realized that the Japanese advance was unstoppable and that the defense of Manila was already a lost cause. On the 26th of December, he declares it an open city and orders his men to retreat to the last defensive point, Bataan, where they dug in on the 6th of January, 1942. Encountering no resistance and finding the military installations abandoned and destroyed, the Japanese triumphal march is running ahead of schedule. And only 25 days after the start of the invasion, the Japanese troops are spread throughout the whole of Manila. Japan sees the U.S. withdrawal as an acknowledgement of defeat. At headquarters, the Philippines campaign is considered a success, and a whole division of soldiers is ordered to return to Java. A garrison is given the task of carrying out the cleanup operation. The largest fixed guns in the world ready for action protect the island from attacks from the south, the east, and the west. But the commander-in-chief of the army in Singapore, General Sir Arthur Percival, believes the attack will come overland from the north, with simultaneous landings on the beaches of Siam and the north of Malaysia. The new defense plan, called Matador, involves the transfer of British troops to Siam to defend the beaches against a Japanese invasion. With this in mind, reinforcements arrived in Singapore in November 1941. The Japanese plans for invasion are centered on the use of the same beaches earmarked in the British plan. 3 of the Imperial Army's strongest divisions form the invasion force. They are specially trained for jungle warfare. From Indochina, the Japanese planes launched their first attacks on the British colony. The British troops are unable to prevent the Japanese landings, which are accompanied by heavy bombings of Singapore. Only 15 British planes survived the attack, unable to compete with the highly maneuverable Japanese Zeros. Within 24 hours, the airspace over the Malayan Peninsula belongs to the Japanese. With the Air Force paralyzed, the British are unable to protect their fleet, and the battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales are sunk. Never before had such a blow been struck, Churchill lamented. Before the Japanese in the Far East, Britain had been shown to be weak and defenseless. Once air superiority is established, the Japanese advance along the peninsula. At the head of the attack, infantrymen on bicycles advance at great speed along the well-built British roads. The British demolition tactics are incapable of holding up this bicycle blitzkrieg. Japanese units, specialized in reconstruction, rapidly repair the bridges to allow the passage of tanks and trucks. With teams of engineers working around the clock, they are able to frustrate the British plans. The most important cities of the British colonies are falling. On the 24th of December, 1941, Hong Kong surrenders. 12 million prisoners experienced the brutality of the Japanese soldiers. Japanese plans look forward to victory in 100 days. By the 7th of January 1942, the front is 400 kilometers from Singapore. The speed of the Japanese advance does not allow the British troops, untrained in jungle warfare, to reorganize. The only option is to hold up the invaders as long as possible and destroy whatever might be useful to the enemy before retreating. The British do not have a single tank in Malaysia, the military experts having decided that they would be of no use in jungle warfare. The orders are to withdraw to Singapore and destroy the road that links the island with the peninsula. Yamashita calls on the British to surrender, but the defenders continue to fight on. Churchill orders his generals to defend Singapore till the death. Surrender is unthinkable. But without water and food, the British commander Arthur Percival decides to surrender to the Tiger of Malaysia in the hope that those under his command will receive humane treatment. The reality was very different. The Japanese killed 5,000 citizens and 50,000 prisoners were submitted to torture and forced labor under the burning sun. It had taken the British almost 20 years to build the fortress of Singapore. The Japanese captured it in 70 days, in the confidence that they were fulfilling their imperial destiny. But the British had an old saying: "We can lose every battle, except the last one." On the 8th of January 1942, wrongly judging the U.S. positions and underestimating their strength, the Japanese launched an offensive against Bataan. On the first day, they meet little opposition. General Hama is informed that the Americans are running to the forests without a fight. The U.S. troops are facing difficulties feeding more than 100,000 civilians and military personnel, while the Japanese enjoyed control of the sea and air and could therefore bring in reinforcements at any time. No U.S. counterattack stood a chance of succeeding. For the Americans, the objective was clear: to defend their positions and await reinforcements. Gaining time would be a victory of sorts. In Washington, President Roosevelt, contrary to what General MacArthur had told his men, decided it would be impossible to hold the Philippines as any reinforcements would be intercepted by the Japanese. After 2 months, the efforts of the soldiers to repel the Japanese attacks were taking their toll, and there was no sign of any reinforcements. It was a great blow for the men when MacArthur, on the President's orders, left for Australia on the 10th of January with the mission of organizing U.S. forces for a great counterattack against the Japanese. Together with his wife and son, he undertakes a dangerous escape to Australia, evading the Japanese blockade in a PT-41 motor torpedo boat. But MacArthur does not forget the men he leaves behind. On the 16th of March, he arrives at the Bachelor Airfield in the Northern Territory, and from there goes on to Tarawa. On the 20th, he makes a speech remembering the men he has left behind in Bataan and Corregidor, sending them a message of hope and a solemn promise.
I shall return.
I shall return. Although he does not agree with Roosevelt's and Churchill's Germany First strategy, he accepts the post of Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Southwest Pacific area, despite the fact that this means sharing command in the area with Admiral Chester Nimitz. His strong and controversial personality has turned him into a symbolic figure for the Philippine people, the Australians, and his own countrymen. His vanity and arrogance are reflected in another of his famous statements. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. For many, MacArthur represented the best hope of final victory in the Pacific. The soldiers in Bataan were left to their luck. In a dangerously malarial area, without reinforcements and with supplies running out, the U.S. Army begins to disintegrate. Casualties of hunger are greater than those wounded by enemy fire. Without proper nutrition, the soldiers are much more vulnerable to all types of tropical diseases. 1,000 soldiers a day are being admitted into the makeshift hospitals, suffering from malaria alone. But the Japanese are not in a much better situation, and for the same reasons. Illness and shortages of food and medicines have reached critical levels. But there is one big difference. The Japanese reinforcements and artillery are making themselves felt. By the end of March, 30,000 Japanese soldiers surround Bataan. On the 3rd of April, they launched a furious attack against the U.S. and Philippine soldiers, who are forced to retreat to the south of the peninsula. On the 9th of April, 1942, with a view to avoiding the pointless suffering of his men, General King surrendered to the Japanese. Around 80,000 Americans and Philippine soldiers were taken prisoner. Sick, starved, and thirsty, they were forced to march under the burning sun. Approximately 10,000 of them died en route, more indeed than on the battlefields of Bataan. It would become known as the Bataan Death March. The fortified island of Corregidor is the last obstacle for the Japanese. With Bataan fallen, the American fortress on the island is at the mercy of the Japanese guns. The 15,000 soldiers defending the island, only 2 miles off the coast, endure weeks of continuous daily bombardments from land and air. Finally, the 2,000 Japanese soldiers, supported by tanks, achieve their aim. After 149 days of fighting on the 6th of May, 1942, General Jonathan Wainwright signed the unconditional surrender of the Philippines. The sporadic fighting finally ceased on the 9th of June. The Americans lost 30,000 men, and the 12,000 Philippine soldiers were killed or wounded, while the victory cost the Japanese 12,000 casualties. Successive Japanese victories in the Pacific and India, where they have put an end to the British presence on the Malayan archipelago, have provoked Roosevelt into trying to regain the initiative in the war sooner rather than later in order to halt the Japanese advance. Therefore, the U.S. General Staff, taking advantage of Japan's strategic error in not having invaded the Hawaiian Islands, and with a view to future events, has ordered the Pacific bases to be renovated and equipped with the latest technology. Meanwhile, the Japanese government and people celebrate their victories, paying tribute to their armies, which they consider invincible. Most of the commanders believe that the occupied territories provide a buffer zone that guarantees the country's defense. However, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Imperial Fleet, is not so sure. He thinks it was a mistake to not have occupied Hawaii and fears the reaction of the enemy. The Japanese victory was far from crushing, and therefore, taking into consideration the possibility of future peace negotiations with the United States, it is necessary to develop a strategy that swings the balance in favor of Japan. Yamamoto believes the confrontation should not last more than a year and should end with a convincing Japanese victory. It will be necessary to deal the enemy a crushing blow in order to keep the new frontiers of the empire in the long run. If not, all will be lost. The admiral, who initially did not support the war, is wary of U.S. power and the character of the Americans, which he believes he knows something about, having been a naval attaché in Washington after the First World War. Despite the hard blow suffered by the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Yamamoto advises his general staff, "We will have to defeat it completely, or we will have many difficulties to keep hold what we have gained." Fearful of the reaction of the sleeping giant, he requests from Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki a short-term strategic plan that includes the Imperial Fleet. Ugaki, an impulsive man who will end up promoting kamikaze attacks in Okinawa, where he himself will die in one such attack, believes that the only way to defend Japan's interests in the area is by closing off the maritime frontier to the east of the country. In order to achieve this protective barrier, it will be necessary to conquer Australia and the Hawaiian Islands. Yamamoto believes Ugaki's plan is too ambitious, requiring too great a logistical effort, as both Hawaii and Australia are far away. He also fears that Britain will be defeated by Germany, and its fleet will pass over to the Americans who, according to his calculations, will be up to full military capacity within a year. Aware of Roosevelt's plans, he insists that the prime objective must be to destroy what remains of the U.S. fleet in the Pacific in a definitive confrontation that puts an end to the war. Therefore, the right strategy, he believes, is to seek this decisive battle between the Allied and the Japanese fleets. If this does not come about during the course of 1942, Japan will lose the war and consequently all of the territories occupied. At the beginning of May, the different points of view on the armed forces' plans of action caused tension in the Imperial General Staff. The conquest of the Philippines, Guam, Malaysia, Burma, and the Dutch Indies has involved the loss of only 23 ships. This leads some commanders, such as Admiral Nagano, to believe that the best option is to expand westwards, occupying India and Ceylon. But Yamamoto argues that a long war would reduce the possibilities of staying dominant in the Pacific. The reaction of the enemy cannot be ignored, and the only way to keep hold of the new empire is by destroying the U.S. fleet while there still is time. As a first step, it will be necessary to take the islands of Midway, Johnston, and Palmyra, primary strategic points, to carry out a definitive attack on the Hawaiian bases. These plans will require the involvement of large contingent of troops. Although the Army commanders are more interested in expanding in continental Asia and the Soviet Union, Yamamoto's authority after Pearl Harbor and his subsequent conquests is indisputable. The definitive strategic plan will be based on two large-scale operations. MO will take place in May and involve taking Port Moresby on the island of Papua New Guinea. This will protect the southern flank, where the base of Rabaul is situated, from which, if the war is going well, it will be possible to think about the conquest of New Caledonia and Australia. In June, the second operation, 10, will begin and consist of two simultaneous phases. The first will involve a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, very close to Alaska, with the intention of drawing out a large part of the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor. The second, which will involve a majority of the ships of Imperial Fleet, will consist of an attack on the main objective, Midway Atoll, situated 1,800 kilometers to the northwest of Hawaii and 3,200 kilometers from Japan. This post, decisive for Japanese interests, marks the northwest frontier of the main U.S. naval base in the Pacific and is manned by a reduced number of Marines who keep watch and maintain in operation its civil and military airport. In these circumstances, Yamamoto believes there should be no problem taking it. However, since the disaster of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. intelligence services have been busy trying to discover the enemy's plans. The Allied cryptanalysts under Commander Joseph Rochefort have managed to decipher the Japanese Purple Code, and after considering a variety of hypotheses, they conclude that the attack on the Aleutian Islands will be a feint and the real objective will be Midway. Meanwhile, The little opposition to Yamamoto's plan that exists within the General Staff is overcome when on the 18th, the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, approach the Japanese coast and launch 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers under Colonel James Doolittle against the cities of Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Osaka. The raid does not cause serious damage, but it has a great psychological impact on the military command and on the Japanese people.